the Young Dudes by Miss Kingbane 89, Chapter 12, First Year, Christmas 1971. Lupin, perhaps you can tell me, what are the transfigurative properties of Lapis Philosophorum? McGonagall called out towards the end of the lesson one day. She gave him a very pointed look. The last time she'd asked him a question in front of the class, he had shrugged and looked away. Remus racked his brain. Well, I think that's the one that turns stuff into gold. If you use it right. And Cleopatra the alchemist used it to turn lead into silver, I think. Correct. McGonagall sounded as if she was trying to mask her surprise. 5 points to Gryffindor, and another 5 for making the connection to Cleopatra the alchemist. She's not mentioned in Transfiguration for Beginners. Did you read that in your history text? Remus nodded, aware that everyone was looking at him. Well, excellent. Some of my third-year students are incapable of cross-referencing their studies like that. I'm pleased to see you taking such an interest, she addressed the class. And we will begin discussing alchemy after Christmas. Which reminds me, with the holidays approaching, I'd like to ask any students planning to remain at Hogwarts over the break to let me know by the end of the week. Thank you, you're dismissed. The class stood up to leave. A few people patted Remus on the back as they passed. Mr. Lupin, if you have a moment, McGonagall said just as he was passing her desk. His stomach dropped. He'd gone 2 weeks without attention from her. He should have known something was coming. He stood still, shoving his hands deep in his pockets and staring at his feet as the rest of the class filtered out. Finally, the classroom empty, she walked over and shut the door right in James's face and turned back into the room. Well done today, Remus, McGonagall said kindly. You've been doing really well lately. He looked up at her, startled. She laughed. Don't look so surprised. I'm very impressed. Professor Slughorn and Professor Flitwick had said the same. I want a quick word with you about Christmas. I've spoken with Mrs. Orwell. Who? The lady who runs St. Edmund's. Oh, right, matron. Quite. As you know, the full moon will occur twice in December. The 2nd, that was next week, and the 31st, New Year's Eve. Mrs. Orwell seems to be in the opinion that you would be better off remaining at Hogwarts over Christmas for this reason. I hope you aren't too disappointed. Remus shrugged. I'm not fussed either way. Professor McGonagall nodded very seriously. I shall add your name to the list then. I shall see you next week, Remus. James invited Sirius and Remus to visit him over the break, knowing that neither of them were facing a particularly merry Christmas otherwise. Remus was forced to decline. Even if he hadn't been incredibly shy about visiting James's home and meeting his parents, he was still legally in the care of St. Edmund's local authority and needed written permission from the matron to leave Hogwarts. Sirius, who would have loved the opportunity to spend 2 weeks mucking about with James, racing their brooms and eating chocolate, also had to refuse. His family had made it quite clear that they did not approve of him visiting the Potter family under any circumstances. Bellatrix, that bitch, has been feeding my parents information, he explained darkly. Apparently, I've disgraced them enough already. If I go to yours, then it'll only get worse. Sorry, mate. Remus went to the edge of the grounds with the Marauders all to wave them off on the last day of the term. We'll send you owls, James promised. See if you can come up with our next plan to attack Snape. Remus grinned and promised he would try. He hoped that the letters James sent would not be too long. He was the only Gryffindor first year staying back behind the grate and trudged on the only path back up to the castle. The next day, he enjoyed ironing, something they were never allowed to do at St. Edmund's. He slept until 10 o'clock when Frank Longbottom poked his head round the door. Come on, Lupin, you'll miss breakfast at this rate. Remus really liked Frank. He had a broad, friendly face and an easy-going manner. He seemed altogether solid and dependable, like an older brother. He understood that Remus was used to being an outsider and tried to include him wherever possible without pushing him too hard. After breakfast, Frank disappeared to the owlery, and Remus sat glumly in the common room, feeling the next 2 weeks stretched before him, empty and lonely. He considered a walk around the grounds, but it had started to rain heavily. He played a few of Sirius's records and flipped through a stack of magazines some 4th years had left behind, just looking at the pictures. They were mostly of pretty, glamorous witches and handsome wizards. He supposed it was a fashion mag. The next few days passed in much the same way. Frank would get him up in the morning. He'd eat all his meals with the remaining Gryffindors in the Great Hall, but otherwise he was left to his own devices. He was so bored at one point he even thought about doing some of the homework he'd been set. He'd been trying to improve his handwriting, but it was almost impossible with the ridiculous feather quills they were provided. No one would ever answer him properly when he asked why they couldn't just use bureaus. Even a pencil might have been better. He actually did try to read for a while, but after attempting a paragraph from his biology text, he gave up in frustration. He copied out a few of the diagrams instead. Remus didn't mind drawing, he liked the freedom of it. Every day, he walked around that castle a few hours with his map. The other boys had long since discarded theirs, having learnt all the classroom locations after the first week or so. But Remus dug on to his, still bothered by its incompleteness. He'd begun marking it up himself, adding points of interest, hiding places in the secret passageway he found. The rest of the time he spent avoiding teachers who were concerned about his being alone. He wasn't the only student left in the school, but most of the others were 6th and 7th years, who generally stayed in the library revising hard for exams or working on their coursework. Slughorn was holding his special extra potions classes in the dungeons, but Remus hadn't been invited and probably wouldn't have gone anyway. He practiced a few spells and entertained himself for a good few hours trying to see how many objects in their dorm he could levitate at once. He made a game of it, throwing various objects, books, gobstones, decks of cards, up in the air and trying to stop them before they hit the ground. He had to stop that eventually when Frank knocked on the door and told him irritably to keep the noise down. Saturday, 24th December 1971. On Christmas Eve, Remus was woken earlier than usual. It was still quite dark. Heavy rain pelted the thick glass window panes. It sounded a bit loud enough to echo through the empty dorm, but that wasn't what disturbed him. The door was creaking open and someone had stepped inside. Sitting up and peering through the gloom, Remus had expected to see Longbottom telling him to get up for breakfast. But it wasn't Frank. It was a very soggy and dishevelled-looking boy with long hair and a haughty face. "Sirius!" Remus leapt out of bed, overjoyed to see his friend. Sirius pushed his wet hair out of his eyes. He'd clearly been out in the rain. He pulled off his heavy travelling cloak, dropped it in a pile on the floor. "All right, Lupin?" he grinned. "Freezing, innit?" He pointed his wand at the fireplace. "Incendio." "What are you doing here?" "That's enough," he said simply, pulling off his boots, which were caked in mud. "Got into an argument with Dad, then the whole family got into it. All the usual stuff. Called me a blood traitor, shame of the family, etc., etc." He flopped down on his bed. "So I left." "Wow." Remus rubbed his eyes, awestruck. "How'd you get here?" "Blue powder," Sirius shrugged. "To a pub in the village, then just walked up." "Wow," Remus repeated. "I'm starving. They sent me to bed last night without dinner. Come on, get dressed. Breakfast." McGonagall was not as pleased to see Sirius as Remus was. The two boys attempted to take their seats at the table as if nothing was out of the ordinary, but she appeared at the side almost immediately. "Mr. Black," she said, a note of warning in her voice which Remus recognised from his detentions. "What is the meaning of this?" "Missed you too, Professor," he grinned up at her. The corner of the old witch's mouth twitched, but she kept her composure. "You were seen walking onto the grounds from Hogsmeade at 6 o'clock this morning. Do you care to explain yourself further?" Sirius shook his head. "Not really, Professor. That's pretty much all there is to it." McGonagall sighed, shaking her head lightly. She had the same look of pity she usually reserved for Remus. "Very well, Mr. Black. I shall have to contact your parents, of course, so they know where you are." "No need," Sirius replied, nodding at the flock of owls which had just swooped into the room. The largest of the birds, a huge, stately eagle owl, dropped a thick red envelope into Sirius's plate. He looked down at it and then up at McGonagall with a wry smile. "I think they know exactly where I am." He picked up the ominous envelope and, without breaking eye contact with McGonagall, ripped it open. Almost immediately, the letter began to shriek. The voice was so loud that it filled up the entire hall, causing heads to turn. McGonagall winced at the ear-splitting pitch of it. It was the voice of Sirius's mother. "Sirius O'Ryan Black," it screeched. "How dare you defy your father in this matter?" Remus covered his ears. Sirius remained perfectly still, looking up at McGonagall. "Consorting with half-breeds and blood traitors, turning your back on your family. If your grandfather was alive, he'd have you disowned the moment you were sorted. You will remain at school until the end of the year, and you can think about the shame and dishonour you've brought your noble title. Don't think we won't disinherit you. You are not our only son." With that, the leather burst into flames, curling and shriveling into a pile of chalk-white ash. The silence that followed was deafening. Everyone was staring. Sirius reached for some toast, put it on his plate, and then began ladling scrambled egg to it nonchalantly. He glanced up at McGonagall again. "You can send Mother now if you like, Professor, but I doubt she'll read it." "Very well, Sirius," McGonagall nodded. "Just try to keep out of trouble, will you?" With that, she walked stiffly back to the teacher's table at the far end of the hall. Sirius ate his breakfast in silence. Years later, Remus would always remember thinking in that moment that Sirius Black must be the bravest boy in the world. Christmas Day at St. Edmund's was usually an extremely noisy affair. Some boys got presents delivered, those with distant relatives who cared enough to send new sweatshirt perhaps, but not enough to visit. Others made do with the usual selection of donations from the locals, which matron had wrapped up for them. Gift-getting was quickly followed by gift-swapping. They often passed the morning bartering and trading the meagre items they received. They were made to smarten themselves up, then led in a long line down to the church, where they would sit through the Christmas service, bored and slouching. Christmas morning at Hogwarts was a good deal more pleasant. Remus was almost touched to find that matron had not forgotten him. The post had arrived overnight, and at the end of his bed he found a card from her, as well as a lumpy package which contained a bag of nuts, an orange, and a tin of biscuits. To his amazement, James had also sent a present, his very own set of gobstones. Peter had been sent a box of chocolate frogs. "Merry Christmas," Sirius yawned, opening his own gifts. He had nothing from his parents, as far as Remus would see, but he didn't mention it. James had sent him an annual of his favourite Quidditch team, the Southend Scorchers, and he had a box of frogs from Peter too. "Merry Christmas," Remus returned. "I didn't get anyone presents," he admitted guiltily. "I didn't know if they would." "Don't worry about it," Sirius replied on his way to the bathroom. "No one expected you to." This troubled Remus, but he tried not to think about it. While Sirius was in the loo, another owl flew in the window and dropped the large, flat, square package on his bed. When Sirius came out and saw it, his eyes lit up and he ripped it open eagerly. "It's from Andromeda!" he exclaimed, pulling the record out and showing it to Remus, who hurried over excitedly. It was another Muggle album. The cover was black, printed with the silhouetted image of a man standing in front of a huge amplifier playing a guitar. He had long, wild, curly hair, stood out with his legs apart in a power stance, outlined in gold. "Electric Warrior," the title blared. "T-Rex." "Oh, T-Rex, I think I've heard of him," Remus said as Sirius flipped it over to read the track listening. "Stick it on," Remus encouraged impatiently. Who cared what the cover said? Sirius did, sliding out the slick black disc and setting it on his turntable. The record began to turn and the room filled with music, a smooth sliding frog. Beneath the bebop moon, I wanna croon with you. They sat and listened, entranced, stopping only to flip to the B-side. Once it was over, Sirius wordlessly turned it over and began at the beginning again. They alternated between sitting on the bed, swaying slightly to the melody, or nodding their heads as the beats quickened. They shared grins with each other at the catchiest riffs, and lay down to stare at the ceiling for the slower, dreamier tracks. Eventually, halfway through the second listen, Frank came in. "Merry Christmas, lads. Come on, breakfast." They dressed quickly and went on to the dining hall. The great hall had been decorated garishly by the teachers. Glittering ropes of tinsel, red and green gold, sparkled from every rafter, hanging down like festive jungle vines. 12 enormous trees twinkled with lights in every colour imaginable, and the bubbles the size of footballs hang from each branch. After breakfast, the boys ran back upstairs to listen to the album again. "It's the coolest thing I've ever heard," Remus declared. Sirius nodded solemnly. Sirius's favourite song was Jeepster. He loved the twanging chords and the aggressive thump of it. Remus liked Monolith the best. It was spacey and smooth, the words both nonsensical and meaningful at the same time. It made him feel like he was floating. The rest of the day, they played music in the common room, ate their way through the chocolate frogs, nuts and biscuits, and played rowdy games of exploding snap. Meals at Hogwarts were always spectacular, and Christmas dinner was no different. But the time night had fallen, Remus had eaten so much he thought he might never be hungry again. Though he didn't say it to Sirius, who, after all, had been forced to run away from home for the first, if not the last time, it was Remus's best Christmas ever.
All the Young Dudes by Miss King Bean 89, Chapter 13, First Year, Vincula Magna. Tuesday, 27th December 1971. With Boxing Day over and done with, Remus and Sirius found themselves caught in those strange Noah days between Christmas Day and New Year's Day as they awaited their friend's return. Sirius was keen to plan their revenge on Snape. In fact, he was no longer interested in attacking all of the Slytherins anymore, wanting to focus his energies on one single nemesis. Remus was inclined to agree. He'd been too furious with Snape to think clearly about it for the first few weeks. He couldn't shake the feeling that Severus had somehow hit upon the exact text that would cause Remus the most upset. He didn't know quite how the Slytherin boy had managed it, and it was very likely just a clever guess, but he didn't care. "We should just get James's cloak, follow him around till he's alone, and then beat the shit out of him," Remus growled as they sat in the empty common room one evening. He gripped the arm of the settee as he said this, feeling the leather creak under his grasp. It was getting close to the full moon, and his temple was closer to the surface than usual. Now, Lupin," Sirius chattered smoothly, carrying a pile of books he brought from the library. "You're thinking like a muggle. If we're going to get him, we're going to get him with magic." "Not more books," Remus whined as Sirius plopped down beside him, an enormous tome in his arms. He opened it, and it was so big that the cover rested across both of their skinny legs. "Yes, more books," Sirius replied breezily. "You'll love them once you get to know them, I promise." Remus wasn't so sure about that. It was true he'd grown to quite like their secret study sessions, and had been privately amazed at the amount that he had learned. But listening to Sirius was one thing. Sitting down alone and staring at a block of text was another thing. Still, Sirius kept promising him that he was getting closer to a solution. "So what's this one about?" Remus asked, resigning to his fate. If Sirius wanted to do something, there was very little anyone could do to stop him. He just had to hold on tight until it was over. X's and jinxes. A lot of them are really complex though. I mean, we're good. You, me, and James anyway. But I still think we should stick to the basics. Simplicity is key. "Okay," Remus replied dully. He still preferred the idea of a surprise beating. "So I thought we could brainstorm all the stuff we can do and see if that lends itself to any good jinxes," Sirius continued, undeterred by Remus's reluctance. "So I'm really good at transfiguration. I got the best marks even after you started catching up." "Right," Remus agreed. "And James is a bit better than me at defense against the dark arts, which you'd think would be helpful when dealing with a slimy creep like Snivellus, but we haven't really learned any good spells yet, except disarming stuff, and that's no use." He chewed the nib of his quill, considering. It wasn't a new quill, and left a dark stain on Sirius's bottom lip. Remus didn't say anything. Sirius carried on. "James is good at flying too, obviously, but I don't know how that's going to be any help. Then there's Peter, good at sneaking around and grunt work, I suppose." Remus thought that was rather unfair. Peter was never top of the class like Sirius and James, but he was usually generally perfectly competent, usually setting for a satisfactory mark. He lacked the competitive edge James and Sirius had, the desire to prove himself. Remus recognised this well enough. It was enough to just be friends with cleverer, more confident people, sometimes. He got a bit of their shine with none of the pressure. "Pete's good at herbology," Remus pointed out. "And potions." "Both useless," Sirius shrugged. "You were the one who came up with the rosehip thing, and we're never going to best Snape at potions. I hate to admit it, but the bastard's too good. Anyway, then we've got you. You're probably the best at charms." "Not best," Remus said hurriedly. "Good at levitation, I suppose, but that's it." "Oh, shut up. This is no time for modesty, Lupin." Sirius waved an impatient hand. "You pick up spells quicker than anyone. If we find a sufficiently hideous hex in here, I'm counting on you to figure out how to do it." Remus squirmed. He hated when Sirius talked like that, as if Remus was as clever, gifted and talented as he and James were. He knew it wasn't true, and it embarrassed him. He fought a sudden urge to push the big heavy book off their laps and walk away. It was just a full moon, he told himself. He felt fidgety and too hot by the fire, too close to Sirius, whose blood he could smell mixed with the unique scent of magic. He vaguely hoped that dinner would be red meat, something he could taste the iron in. It has to be something big, Sirius murmured, flipping all the way to the back of the book. Remus let out a yelp as the full weight of it thudded against his thighs. Sirius ignored this, running a finger down the index. Something much worse than the hair thing. Remus shuddered at the thought of Snape's prank. Rage surged up in him again. Or was it hunger? He shook his head, pushing the book away and getting up, pretending he just had to stretch. His joints ached already as his body prepared itself for the upcoming transformation. I don't know why you think I'll be of any help, Remus sighed, yawning now. Muggle insight, Sirius grinned. Like that itching powder. You can come up with stuff Snape won't see coming. Remus scratched his head, racking his brain. Can't think of anything bad enough, he said. Once we got a bucket of water and propped up over the door, which you would have to leave a bit ajar, the matron was supposed to walk through and get soaked. Except matron didn't walk through, the cook did. We got served shit food for a month. His stomach growled at the mention of food. It's a pretty tame prank, to be honest. Are you hungry? Can we go down for dinner yet? Yeah, I suppose. Sirius closed the book. We could get a bucket pretty easily, but it seems like there's a lot of room for error, and I don't know if it would really strike fear into its art the way we want it to. We're Marauders. We should be setting certain standards. Remus chuckled as they climbed through the portrait hole. Yeah, told you it was rubbish. Shame, 'cause Snivelus could do with a good wash. Sirius laughed back. Then he froze and gripped Remus's shoulder. Oh, you genius! You bloody genius! What? Remus replied, shocked and a bit annoyed to be shaken about like that. A good wash, that's what we'll do. It's easy, I bet. It'll be in one of these books. Wait here. It disappeared back through the portrait. Remus sighed hungrily and waited. So, wait, explain it to me again? Remus whispered as they finished their plates. He used the remains of his roast potato to mop up what remained of the gravy. He might have seconds. He ate like a horse on the nights before the moon. It sounds complicated. It isn't. Sirius shook his head. I reckon it's easy. Weather spells are odd on a grand scale, but this only needs to be the cloud size of this plate. He tapped the porcelain in front of him. Would it be like the ceiling? Remus asked, jerking his head up at the charmed rafters. It was raining, as it had been all Christmas, but the downpour vanished before it reached them. A bit, Sirius replied, but smaller, and without whatever charms are stopping us from getting wet. But couldn't he just step away from it? Not if we combine it with a binding spell. But we can't mix spells yet. I can't. Can you? He looked up at Sirius, who was nodding vigorously. Yeah, I've been having a go at it for your reading thing. It's actually not too hard. You just have to concentrate. That's what they say about reading, Remus sighed. We'll practice, Sirius said firmly. We'll practice loads before James and Pete get back. They'll be dead impressed. There was no time for seconds after that, so Remus had to satisfy himself with the remainder of his Christmas biscuits as Sirius looked up weather charms. Once he'd found what he wanted, they both took it in turns to have a go, Sirius reading it out the directions several times before they understood them. It was the first time Remus had attempted a spell without having it demonstrated for him first. Daunting to begin with, he had quickly understood how the one movement ought to flow and twist, while Sirius was the best at pronunciation. It did take a lot of concentration, and it was nearly midnight by the time either of them had produced anything at all. Finally, Remus managed to cast a small grey cloud. It poured from his wand like smoke and then hovered between them for a few moments before bursting like a bubble, leaving only a faint trace of condensation. Sirius grinned broadly. This is going to work. Saturday, 31st December 1971. It was odd to shake off Sirius on the night of the full moon. Remus even told him he was feeling sick, but then the other boy wanted to accompany him to the hospital wing. Eventually, he managed to convince him that he ought to stay behind and keep practicing the rain cloud charm. We've basically got it now, though, Sirius complained. It was true. They both managed to produce satisfactory miniature rainstorms. The bathroom had almost flooded in the process. It was just a matter of maintaining concentration and perfecting the binding aspect now. Find something else to do then, Remus snapped, halfway out the door, skin crawling and stomach growling. I'll see you tomorrow. How do you know she'll keep you overnight? Remus had escaped before having to answer any more questions. He was getting careless, he thought to himself as he knocked on McGonagall's office door. Eventually he'd have to think of a decent excuse for all his absences. They were sure to connect the nights he vanished to the full moon. Eventually, they all did astronomy together. The shack was cold, the walls damp from the relentless rain. Remus wished he'd brought his wand. He'd learned to cast a good fire charm now, but he supposed it would be no good if there was a fire blazing when he turned. It might burn the whole place down. The transformation came on more suddenly than usual. Ever since Madame Pomfrey had told him he would get worse, he seemed to feel it more. He still fought not to scream, worried that McGonagall or Pomfrey might hear him on the way out the tunnel. He didn't need any more pity. Sunday, 1st January 1972. The next day, Remus could barely get up until he changed back. He pulled a blanket around himself instead and lay on the floor waiting for Madame Pomfrey to arrive. Every inch of him hurt, more than ever. His head pounded as if a troll had stomped on it. Every tooth in his jaw ached. The tendons in his shoulders felt as if they had been stretched so far they had snapped. He'd broken almost all of his fingernails. There were huge claw marks on the wallpaper. "Remus?" Madame Pomfrey's soft voice came through the door. "I'm coming in now, dear." He closed his eyes, unable to even groan. "Oh," she said as she entered the room and found him on the floor. "Bad one, was it? Perhaps it's the solstice. I'll have to consult my books." "Can you get up, Remus?" She touched his forehead with the back of her hand. He opened his eyes and nodded weakly, taking her arm and holding himself up. That was a mistake. As soon as he was on his feet, his head swam and his stomach lurched. He bent forward and vomited onto the floor. "Never mind," Madame Pomfrey said kindly, an arm around his trembling shoulder. She pointed a wand at the mess and it vanished in an instant. "No harm done. Let's get you somewhere warm now, shall we?" She wanted to magic a stretcher to carry him back to their castle, but he couldn't bear the shame of it, no matter how early the morning was. They walked back very slowly and up to the hospital wing, where he finally collapsed into a clean, soft bed. The nurse continued to fuss around him, but he was already drifting to sleep. He woke up feeling marginally better. His headache had left him anyway. He blinked blearily, reaching for the glass of water beside him. Someone picked it up and handed it to him. He drank deeply and then set it down. Looking up, expecting to see Madame Pomfrey, jumped. "Sirius!" he rasped, his throat still sore. God, had he actually been howling? How embarrassing. "Happy New Year," Sirius said cheerily. He was sitting on a little wooden stool there for visitors, clutching a book to his chest. "Thought I'd come looking for you when you weren't at breakfast. You all right?" "Fine," Remus said, sitting up, hurriedly rubbing his head. I get migraines sometimes. I'm feeling better." "Good," Sirius nodded, "because I've got your Christmas present ready." "My what?" Remus stared at Sirius warily. His blue eyes were bright and full of mischief. "Sorry it's late," he was saying. "I had a few last-minute tweaks to make. Here." He handed over the book. It was Remus's copy of the History of Magic. "What?" Remus wasn't sure if he was just having a very odd dream. Why was Sirius giving him his own history book? "Open it." Remus did. He had hardly opened the book all year. All the pages were stiff and immaculate, except for the very first page. Below the title, Sirius had written something in his own neat cursive handwriting. Remus squinted at it, his mouth twisting with effort. He was already exhausted and didn't have the energy for riddles. "Sirius," he sighed, "you know I can't—" "Put your hand on it," Sirius said eagerly, stepping forward. Palm flat against the page. "Yeah, like that. Now give me a moment." He withdrew his wand from his pocket and placed the point lightly against Remus's temple. "Sirius, what are you doing?" Remus was alarmed. He never had a wand pointed at him before, and he'd seen Sirius blow up bigger things than his head. "Trust me," Sirius shushed him. A look of concentration came over his face. He took a deep breath. Remus squeezed his eyes shut, preparing for the worst. At least he was already in the hospital wing. "The Tunicula Magna," Sirius said forcefully. Remus felt an odd jolt, as if he'd missed the last step on a staircase. It hadn't hurt exactly, and at least his head was still attached. He opened his eyes and looked at Sirius. "What was that?" "Look at the book," Sirius pointed, practically dancing on the spot with excitement. "Tell me what it says." Remus sighed and looked down at the book on his lap. It was exactly the same. A blank white page with Sirius's slightly slanted thick black handwriting. He stared at it, not sure what he was supposed to be doing. "Read it," Sirius prompted. Remus looked down and looked at the first word. "Happy?" a voice said in his head. Remus blinked in shock. He'd never heard this voice before, though it sounded like him. It was almost like the saw now, only more familiar, less invasive. It looked again. "Happy Christmas," it read. "Now you can do your own bloody homework. From your fellow marauder and friend, Sirius Black." Remus laughed. He looked at Sirius and then back to the page. He split the book open to the middle page and looked at the words printed there. During the late 16th century, Cornelius Agrippa made his greatest advancements in the field of natural magic. "Oh my God!" Remus exclaimed. He flipped the page again and read more. The voice continued confidently. He could read. "Oh my God!" "It worked then?" Sirius asked, beaming. "Sirius, I can't. How?" "Oh no," Sirius chuckled. "Don't tell me I've messed up your brain so much you can't even form a coherent sentence." "Thank you," was all Remus could say. He could feel his eyes stinging with tears and immediately rub them hard with his fists. Sirius looked away politely. "It's okay," he replied. "Now you can help me research our next big prank."
We haven't even got the first one off the ground yet, Remus replied, sniffing hard, pulling himself together. "You have to show me how you did this. It must be really advanced magic." "Sort of," Sirius shrugged. "Got the idea after Mother's owlet, actually. Thought if you could get a letter to scream at someone, then you could get a book to read to someone. Keeping the voice in your head was the hardest part. Couldn't tell if it was working on me, if I was just reading the book normally. Works on any book, though, I think. Not sure about other stuff yet, like potion labels or signs, but we can keep working on it." Remus couldn't stop staring at that book, reading random lines, grinning to himself. He didn't think he'd ever been so happy in his life. All the Young Dudes by Miss King Bean 89, Chapter 30, Second Year, Christmas with the Potters. Remus had thought that nothing could be much better than Christmas at Hogwarts, which was quite literally magical. Christmas at the Potters, however, was an entirely different experience that seemed to only get better. First, there was tobogganing down the snowy slopes in the back garden, though at over 500 acres, no one could really call it a garden. Peter, who lived further down in the main village, came out to join them as soon as he heard they had arrived. They had an extremely noisy and violent afternoon, careering down the hillsides and playing complex war games with snowball ammunition. Mr. Potter even joined in, sprightly for his age, and with the considerable advantage of being able to use magic. Mrs. Potter called them all in for lunch and made them all change out of their freezing wet clothes. They sat by the fireplace, warm and dry, eating hot toasted tea cakes smeared with rich yellow butter. In the afternoon, they wanted to go out again, but Mr. Potter had gone to lie down and Mrs. Potter didn't want them out so close to nightfall. Instead, they helped to decorate an enormous Christmas cake with white royal icing in tiny magical figurines, then to wrap presents for the neighbours and the house elves. "We never got anything for the house elf," Sirius said, matter-of-factly, his fingers hopelessly bound in some speller tape. "Mind you, Creature's a moody git. I doubt he wants anything." "They'll take gifts as long as it's something edible, I find," Mrs. Potter replied, smiling. "No clothes, of course. That only upsets them." "Tell Mom what your lot does to house elf, Sirius," James grinned, binding his friend's hands up even more. Sirius laughed, lightly. "Mouse their heads," he said, "once they're dead. At least I think we wait till they're dead. Creature's the only house elf I remember." "Goodness," said Mrs. Potter. "I'd rather thought that tradition had died out." "Not with the Blacks," Sirius sighed. Remus could tell that he was thinking about the betrothal again. "You're making a lovely job of that, Remus," Mrs. Potter observed, glancing at the book he was wrapping for Mrs. Pettigrew. "Unlike some naughty boys I can mention." She turned a stern gaze upon her son and his best friend, now attempting to tape their hands to the tabletop. Remus smiled at her, politely, feeling the fresh cut on his face pull at his skin. He still hadn't really said anything to either of James's parents yet. He'd always been told to be seen and not heard around older people, and he had never been to a friend's house before. Sirius, by contrast, was completely at ease. Remus had never seen him happier. He doted on Mrs. Potter as if she was his own mother. If he'd liked his own mother, of course. Remus yawned,
more widely than he meant to, trying to hide behind his hands, ducking his head, embarrassed. He had only slept a few hours that morning, followed the moon, and an afternoon of snowball manoeuvres had left him exhausted. "You'd better go up to bed, dear," Mrs. Potter said, ignoring the fact that it was only 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Remus wondered if James had told his parents about him. They must know. McGonagall might not have let him come otherwise. "Oh, you're all right, aren't you, Lupin?" Sirius called. "Peter's coming back in a bit. We can go out again." Remus blinked at him, then looked at James for help.
Leave him alone, Sirius, Mrs. Potter chided. The poor boy's dead on his feet. Come on, dear, off you go. Gratefully, Remus got up from the kitchen table and made his way up to bed. As he changed into his night things, he couldn't help but steal another glance at himself in the mirror, now that he was properly alone. Perhaps it was having been out in the cold, but the scar looked worse than it had that morning, the contrast harsher with his pale skin. Would his face always surprise him now? Would he always catch a glimpse of himself in some mirror, shining surface and jump? Would other people be afraid of him? There was a soft tap at the door, just as Remus was about to put on the ointment Madame Pomfrey had given him. It was Sirius. Remus caught his scent before he even knocked. "All right?" The dark-haired boy crept inside, speaking quietly. He held a pewter goblet in his hand. "James's mum sent you this. It's a healing draught, I think." "Oh, thanks." Remus nodded tightly. Remus set it down on the bedside table. "You okay?" "Fine, just tired, mate." "Were we too, rough or something?" "No," Remus said, very firmly, probably sounding angrier than he meant to. "It's nothing to do with you two. It's just the fact that I was up all night howling at the bloody moon trying to rip my own face off. I'm tired." Remus had to sit down. The effort of the outburst made him dizzy. "Sorry," Sirius said, even more quietly. It was the second time he'd apologised that day, and Remus hated the sound of it. "I'll leave you." He closed the door.
Remus couldn't bring himself to start worrying about hurting Sirius's feelings. He smeared on some of the ointment, then sniffed the goblet Mrs. Potter had sent. He recognised it as something he'd had before at Hogwarts, which would trigger an instant sleep. Getting to bed, he drained it quickly and closed his eyes. The remaining days before Christmas passed quickly, and Remus was able to experience real family life for the first time. Mr. and Mrs. Potter had been the perfect parents. They were kind and sure, always smiling and full of fun. Remus hadn't known that adults could be that way. He hadn't known that people could grow up like that. It was clearer than ever why James was the way he was, as brimming with love and blind confidence as Remus was brimming with rage. It was obvious, too, why Sirius was so drawn to this family. He had an unquenchable thirst for love, and the Potters had an endless supply. The 4 boys trampled all over the surrounding countryside in the snow, bundled up in their warm Gryffindor scarves, hats and gloves. In the evening, they played card games, helped Mrs. Potter prepare dinner, and listened to Mr. Potter tell ghost stories around the fire. They made mince pies and paper chains, they built snow whizzes and igloos, and had slept so soundly in their beds at night that not even an owlet could have woken them. Unfortunately, it was not to last. Where the Blacks had stopped sending owlets, they had not forgotten their wayward son, and tried a new tact on Christmas Eve, with devastating consequences for the Marauders. They were drinking warm butterbeer and sitting on the earth rug. James and Sirius were playing gobstones, very loudly, and Mr. Potter was teaching Remus to play chess. The old man had been horrified that Remus didn't know how, and Remus was quite surprised to find himself actually quite enjoying the game. The old room felt warm and safe, heavy curtains drawn against the cold and dark, tree lights twinkling softly and the fire popping and crackling beside them. The clock had just struck 9, and Mrs. Potter was about to send them all to bed, when there was a loud crack just outside the window. Mr. and Mrs. Potter shared a quick glance, and Remus's ears pricked like a dog. The smell of magic permeated in the air, like burnt toast, something dark and unsavoury. There was a firm, hollow knock at the door. "Weren't expecting anyone, were we, Effie?" Mr. Potter frowned slightly at his wife. She shook her head, and they both listened. The Potter's house elf, Gully, went scampering towards the front door to answer it. There were stilted voices in the hall, and Gully came hurrying in. "Oh, Mr. Potter, she's come for young Master Black. She's telling me she's his mother. I told him to wait there for you." The elf was wringing his hands anxiously, clearly very confused by this turn of events. Sirius and James looked at each other. Sirius's face was white. He looked like he might be sick. "She wouldn't," he whispered. Mr. Potter was already up and out the door. There were raised voices in the hallway now. Remus recognised Mrs. Black's sharp tone from her horrid letters. "Sirius," Mrs. Potter said gently, "did your parents give you permission to visit us, dear?" He looked at the floor. She clucked her tongue. "Oh, sweetheart," she said, sounding very sad. "Don't make him leave, Mum." James stood up. "He hates them." "They're his parents, James." "Sirius," Mr. Potter called from the hall. Sirius got up. James did too. Remus didn't want to. He wanted to stay by the fire where they'd all been so happy just moments beforehand. But Mrs. Potter had stood up too, and this was one of those times the Marauders had to present a united front, no matter how frightened Sirius's mother was. They all filed out into the hall. Remus had seen Mrs. Black once before, the first time he'd boarded the Hogwarts Express. Back then, he had simply thought she looked very severe, and that she looked like Sirius. She still looked severe. Her hair was slicked back and pulled up in a high bun, which coiled like a serpent at the crown of her head, fixed with an emerald pin. Her eyes were dark, not as blue as Sirius's, but she had that black family bone structure and a superior look. She was shorter than Mr. Potter, but still managed to glaze at him as though he was the filth on her boot. Her look sharpened as she saw James and Remus appear. "Sirius," she said coldly, narrowing her eyes at her eldest son, "you will come with me at once." "Creature!" She snapped her fingers, and an old, wizened-looking house elf emerged from behind her robes. "Go upstairs and fetch Master Black's Sphinx." The house elf bowed deeply, kissing the silver-capped toes of Mrs. Black's pointed boots, and scurried up the stairs. "Good evening, Walpurga," Mrs. Potter said, pleasantly, as if there was no tension at all. "May I offer you a drink? We were just about to crack out the mince pies, weren't we, boys?" Mrs. Black ignored her, looking straight at Sirius. "Put on your cloak. We're leaving now." "But Mother, don't you dare speak to me," she hissed, her eyes flashing. Remus wanted to run away. She was worse than Matron 100 times over. She was worse than Bellatrix and Snape and every nasty person he'd ever met. The thought of letting Sirius go of her made his insides twist. Mr. and Mrs. Potter seemed to be suffering from the same crisis. "Walpurga, why not let him stay?" Mrs. Potter tried. "I know he's been a bit naughty, but there's no harm done. We can have him for lunch and send him back before dinner tomorrow. They've all been having such a nice time together." Mrs. Black let out a short, crackling laugh, as if her son's enjoyment was the least of her concerns. She eyed James, a gaze raking over his mess of hair, then Remus, staring pointedly at his new scar. Remus looked at his feet, terrified. She'd know. She'd know straight away. Remus came scuttling back down the stairs, followed by a very affronted-looking Gully. Sirius's trunk hovered behind them both, apparently packed and ready to go. Walpurga turned. "Come along, Sirius." "No," he said, quietly, but firmly. Remus wanted to tell him to shut up. Couldn't he see how much trouble he was already in? But Sirius was clenching his fists, looking at his mother. "I want to stay here, with the Potters. You can't make me—" "Silencio!" Walpurga spun around, jabbing a wand at Sirius. He stopped speaking at once, though not voluntarily. He opened and closed his mouth a few times, and nothing came out. She had stolen his voice. "Walpurga, really?" Mr. Potter gasped as Mrs. Potter let out a small shriek and knelt beside Sirius, wrapping her arms around him protectively. "He's just a boy." "He is my son," Walpurga purred, looking daggers at Mrs. Potter. "And he is heir to the finest house in Britain. He will learn his place. Come, Sirius." Sirius looked completely defeated, his mouth a straight line of resignation. He hugged Mrs. Potter back, then stepped away from her. He gave James and Remus a small wave before following his mother out the door. The four of them stood in silence after the front door slammed. Remus wondered if James felt as ashamed as he did. Ought they to have stood up for their friend in some way? What would happen to him now? Mr. Potter still looked furious. "Using a silencing charm on her own son? on an underage wizard. It's morally reprehensible. She does worse than that, James said, quietly. Remus nodded in agreement, feeling as though someone had taken his own power of speech. We'll have to make this house unplottable, Fleamont, Mrs. Potter said, suddenly. Make it so he can't be found. You said you were considering it after the last election. I don't ever want that dreadful woman in my house ever again. Mr. Potter nodded, darkly. I'll look into it in the new year. Alistair Moody owes me a favour. Bedtime, boys, Mrs. Potter said, her voice trembling. Try not to worry too much. She hugged James, fiercely, kissing him on each cheek. Remus tried to dodge her, but she grabbed him too, pulling him into a tight embrace. She smelled like orange and clove. Psst, Remus. Remus had just finished brushing his teeth and was making his way down the hall to his room when James poked his head out and ushered him into his own bedroom. They knelt on the bed together. James withdrew a note from his pyjama pocket. Regulus sent this. What does it say? Remus asked him, quickly, before James could give it to him to read. Oh, it says Sirius is home, do not try to contact him. That's all? That's all, James nodded, grimly. Nice of Regulus, Remus remarked, looking down at the note, which was very obviously hastily scribbled down. Thought they hated each other. Yeah, well, they're still brothers, aren't they? James replied, shrugging. Family ties and all that. Do you think he'll be okay? I don't know, James chewed his lip. I never got to give him his present. He said he never gets anything Christmassy from his lot, just family albums and stuff. I had a go at him the other day, Remus sighed, dolefully. About, my furry little problem. James chuckled. Don't worry about it. You two are always having to go at each other about something. Just your personalities. Oh, do you think? Remus was a bit miffed at that observation. Sirius snapped up feet far more often. Surely. James grinned. I told you, don't worry about it. Black loves an argument. Christmas morning was a subdued affair, though the Potters were keen to make it cheerful, if only for Remus. He was embarrassed to find a bulging stocking at the foot of his bed when he woke up, and resolved to correct this next year somehow. There were customary socks and underpants from Matron, plus a tin of shortbread, some chocolate pirogues from Peter, and a big book of advanced charms from Sirius. James had bought him a book too, Conjurer's Cartography, a guide to magical map-making. Mr. and Mrs. Potter, however, had gone above and beyond. Under the tree, he found more sweets, practical jokes, a beautiful set of quills, which he tried to give back. We got the same for James and Sirius, dear, don't be silly, and a brand new pair of pyjamas. The Potters' extended family began arriving for Christmas lunch at about midday, as well as the Pettigrews, who brought with them Peter's elder sister, Philomena, and a muggle boyfriend who she'd brought back from university. Remus was introduced to everyone as a friend of James's, and generally ignored, except for by one tiny and ancient wizard, who was already red-nosed and merry from all of the drinks Gully was passing around. Lupin, you say? Not Lyle Lupin's boy. Remus gaped, unable to answer. He'd only heard his father's name spoken once or twice. Yeah, he said, finally, blushing hard. Is he here? The wizard grinned, looking around. Excellent fellow. I haven't seen him in years. He's dead, Remus replied, with an apologetic shrug. Damn shame, the wizard cried, spilling some of his drink. Fine doodler. Taught me everything I know about Hogwarts. Temper did tend to get him in trouble, though. I told him not to mess about with that greyback chap. Bloody werewolves ought to exterminate the lot of them. Remus blinked. James looked at him, curiously. Fortunately, Mr. Potter intervened. Darius, have another drink, old man. Leave the young people to their games, eh? Remus swallowed hard and returned to the Gobstones tournament as if nothing had happened. All the Young Dudes by Miss Kingby 89, Chapter 50, 3rd Year, Phenomena Pettigrew. Friday 21st December 1973. Once he was finally given the space to think about it, Remus wondered why he even asked for more time. Of course he would say yes. He didn't even think he'd ever say no to his friends, even if it made him nervous. And it did make him nervous. Perhaps it was the excitement that worried him, or their overconfidence. He knew that part of their eagerness had to do with the plan being incredibly illegal, dangerous and reckless. But they were also doing it for him. He wasn't sure how to feel about that yet. Better not think about it. He took James aside one day not long after they'd proposed the idea and asked for all of the research they had so far. It was promptly presented to him as a huge bundle of parchment, reams and reams of notes and diagrams penned in a familiar neat cursive script. To say they had been thorough was an understatement. If only Sirius had paid that much attention to writing his essays, Remus would never have a hope of beating him to the top of the class. They had left no stone unturned. They'd charted the full moons for the next decade at least. They'd practically written an entire history of European lycanthropy, along with feeding habits and migration patterns, pack behaviour, canine communication signals. They had listed every ingredient they would need, its cost and availability. Every ritual was carefully transcribed step by step and the incantation spelled out phonetically. There were timelines, suggested locations for certain aspects of the extensive process. Everything was painstakingly detailed. "Christ," Remus said when he'd finished reading it. "You've done all of this?" "It was mostly Sirius," James grinned. "Actually, basically all of it was Sirius. He did most of it over the summer holidays when he was bored. Real labour of love." Remus's stomach flipped. He didn't know what to say. How could he refuse them after all that? Suddenly selling stolen cigarettes to underage wizards seemed very tame indeed. It was agreed that work would begin in earnest over the Christmas holidays, when they would all be away from Hogwarts. Remus had secured permission from Matron, McGonagall and Madame Pomfrey to spend the break with the Potters, and as always, Peter was only up the road. Sirius was in a dark mood as term drew to a close, until he received a very short note during breakfast one morning. "To Master S.O. Black III. You will not be required at the family home this winter break. Do as you please. Signed, Orion Black." "Yes!" James cheered and was knocking over his porridge. "Might even get you for the summer at this rate." "What about Regulus?" Remus asked, tentatively, quietly in case Sirius wanted to pretend he hadn't heard. "Oh, little Prince Reg is going home for Christmas," Sirius replied, shoving the note into his pocket. "It's just me they've disinvited." "Good. Perfect. Excellent. They don't care. I don't care." He didn't properly cheer up until they were done packing. Sirius covertly showed Remus the gifts he had bought for Mr. and Mrs. Potter, a beautiful golden watch chain and a pretty garnet brooch. "Do you think they're okay?" he asked nervously. "My family's shit at doing presents, so I never really know." "Black? Sirius, they're perfect. Don't worry." Remus felt a sinking feeling as he thought about the slightly shabby box of mid-range biscuits he'd bought for the hosts. It couldn't be helped now. He'd done his best. Remus was actually quite looking forward to Christmas this year, for it may have been the very first time. He was still a bit shy about spending time in someone else's house, but now that he knew how the Potters were, he relaxed into the idea. He had sold the very last of his illicit cigarettes at a premium and bought presents for everyone he could, even Lily, Mary and Marlene. It was a real pleasure giving people presents, he realised, maybe even better than getting them. In addition, despite some reservations, Remus was excited about beginning the animagus process. It would be some of the most complex magic they had performed yet. He had asked McGonagall about it, as subtly as possible. She had praised him for taking an interest, but said it was well above the third year standard, or even seventh year. He relished the thought of proving him wrong. There was one other thing he was hoping to get out of the break, something he hadn't mentioned to the others, because it was private. Last year at the Potter's Christmas party, Remus had been accosted by an old man who knew a lot about Lyle Lupin. At the time, Remus had been struck mute by the revelation and shock of it, but now, a year older and feeling quite mature at the grand old age of 13, Remus hoped he might learn a bit more. Saturday, 22nd December 1973. The full moon had fallen early in the month this year, so all four of the Marauders were able to join their peers aboard the Hogwarts Express on the usual Saturday. In exchange for the usual train journey, Marlene and Mary joined the boys in their carriage. Remus suspected that Lily was somewhere on her own with Severus, probably listening to him whine about how nobody liked him. Did you get your essay back off Ferox? Marlene asked Remus, a deep crease in her brow. Only barely got an acceptable mark, and Mum's going to go mental if I don't get better results this year. Yeah, I did okay, Remus replied, embarrassed by his third outstanding that term. We'll bring back the study club after Christmas, right? Mary put in. Lily's up for it. Don't worry, Miles, you'll be fine. Sounds good, Remus nodded. Mooney's joined a club without us, Sirius wailed, pretending to weep on James's shoulder. He's a big boy now, James patted his friend solemnly. They grow up so fast. Piss off, Remus grinned. They have the Slov Club for ploshers like you. You can study with us if you want, Sirius, Mary purred. Sirius looked alarmed. He used the library exclusively as a resource for jinx and X's, not for doing anything so mundane as homework. Mary didn't know Sirius. Not really. When they'd pulled into King's Cross, Remus felt a certain thrill when he saw Mr. and Mrs. Potter were there to collect all of them. Usually he had to cross the barrier and go looking for Matron in the cafe by the newspaper stand. He was in for a shock, however, when he learned that he was about to apparate for the first time. Hold my arm, dear, Mrs. Potter smiled at him kindly. Close your eyes. It'll all be over in a moment. Remus obeyed, scrunching his eyes shut. It was much worse than flu powder, worse than flying. He nearly dragged Mrs. Potter down with him when they landed, and he lost his balance and fell hard on the pavement outside the Potter's house. Whoopsie daisy, Mrs. Potter laughed kindly, pulling up again. You're all right now. She brushed his knees and shoulders. Now, I'll just pop back for Sirius. Monty will be over with James in 2 ticks. And with a crack, she vanished. Remus barely had time to lean on the low front gate and catch his breath before there was another crack, and Mr. Potter appeared with James. It didn't look half as bad as Remus felt. Once they were all there, Mrs. Potter ushered them all up to the house, sending their trunks flying up the stairs to their respective bedrooms, boiling a kettle and slicing homemade Madeira cake for what felt like a few seconds. As Remus sat at the Potter's big wooden kitchen table, eating cake and sipping a huge mug of tea, listening to James and Sirius chatter 19 to the dozen about the term so far, he couldn't resist sighing contentedly to himself. 2 whole weeks of this. Unfortunately, unlike the previous year, there had been no snow yet this winter, only rain. In fact, as the evening drew on, the downpour grew heavier and heavier until thunder crackled open the sky outside and hailstones battered on the window panes. Rather than go outside, the boys sat on the living room under the Christmas tree, playing games and toasting the occasional tea cake on the fire. Remus himself settled into a book on human transfiguration, and Mrs. Potter reviewed a list for the coming celebrations. We've a few more people coming this year, she explained, as the long thin strips of parchment hovered before her, a royal blue quill working quickly across the surface, ticking off various items. Some friends from the old days and some newer acquaintances. As she said this, she glanced furtively over at Sirius, who wasn't paying attention, immersed in the game. I only just have enough room for all of you, she continued, with a happy smile that was just like her son's. Just then, there was a knock at the door. Sirius sat bolt upright, as if he'd been struck by lightning. He turned to Mrs. Potter's wide-eyed. It wasn't his mother. Remus knew this, but he didn't say so, because how on earth for that sound? Don't worry, Sirius. I know your mother's scent. Too bloody creepy. Mrs. Potter got up, leaving the list hovering in midair, and went to answer the door. A cold breeze blew in, and the 3 boys listened intently. It was a woman, but her voice was higher and younger than Walpurga Black. She sounded as though she was crying, and Mrs. Potter spoke in soothing tones. Boys, she called from the hallway. They got up and went to meet her. She was standing just inside the kitchen. Behind her, a young woman with long blonde hair sat at the table, a red in her hands. What's up, Mum? James asked, craning his neck. It's getting late. You'd all better go to bed. Philly's staying the night, and I'm afraid we'll have no room left. Sirius, would you mind sharing with James tonight, dear? We can all share, James said, generously. Everyone else is arriving tomorrow anyway. Might as well all just bump up together. Mrs. Potter nodded and summoned the house elf.
James's bedroom was absolutely perfect in every way. Huge and spacious, the walls were plastered with Gryffindor banners and Quidditch posters. Every broom he'd ever owned was mounted on the wall, and his shelves were all packed with Wizard's children books and old toys he clearly wasn't ready to let go of just yet. Chief among these was a little knight figurine, apparently supposed to be Godric Gryffindor himself, marching back and forth along the edge of the bookcase. The bed was huge, hung with red velvet drapes, the same as their dorm room, and though it was big enough for all three of them, the house elf had whipped up 2 single beds which lay at the foot of it. "Who is that?" Remus asked, as they all sat on the big bed together in their pyjamas. "Philomena," James said. "Pete's sister. What's she doing here?" "I think she's been arguing with Pete's folks. They don't like her going to a Muggle university, and," he lowered his voice, "Dad said she's got a Muggle boyfriend." "Really?" Sirius's eyes widened in awe. Remus said nothing. He hadn't known that going out with Muggles was particularly taboo. "Yeah, and you know what Mum's like," James nudged Sirius. "Loves taking in strays." Christmas Eve, 1973. Philomena was present at breakfast the next morning and remained for the whole of Christmas. At first, she didn't say very much, but stared into space, pale-faced and red-eyed. What Remus had gathered, going out with a Muggle was not only taboo, but an offence worthy of disowning your own child. Apart from the Potters, Remus couldn't help but think that wizards didn't make very good parents, based on his experience. Peter's sister was about 7 years older than him, and you might not know they were related at all, other than their straw-coloured hair. But Pete was round and pudgy, Philomena was slim and dainty-featured. She had chocolate brown eyes and a delicate smattering of pale brown freckles all over her little nose. Her hair was worn in the same style as many Muggle girls Remus had seen, long and poker straight with a thick parted fringe, like Marianne Faithfull. James, who knew her best, could not do enough for the pretty visitor. He offered her tea, held out a chair, and generally became a willing servant, until even Sirius had enough of him. "Bloody hell, Potter, she's just a girl." "I'm being nice," James frowned. "Nothing wrong with being nice to my mate's sister." They hadn't seen Peter. Once Mrs. Pettigrew learnt where her daughter was staying, he had been confined to the house. They were making do by sending owls back and forward, which was probably more fun for James and Sirius than it was for Peter. "What would Evans say?" Sirius teased James, who turned bright red. "She'd be glad someone's taken his mind off her," Remus suggested from where he was lounging on his camp bed. "You can talk, Black," James shrugged his friend. "What's going on between you and Mary?" "MacDonald?" Sirius asked, innocently. "Don't know what you're talking about." "Oh, come on," James groaned. "Tell us. Have you snogged her or what?" Remus dropped his book. "Snogging? Since when was snogging on the cards?" Sirius gave a coy look. "No. Kissed her cheek, though." "Oh, how scandalous, Black." James threw a pillow at him, and Sirius threw it back, and all of a sudden they were wrestling. Remus usually just rolled his eyes and let them get on with it, but now he used the distraction to gather his thoughts. He felt very childish and silly, not realising that Sirius liked Mary back, that there was kissing involved now, even when there was just a peck on the cheek. Remus racked his brain, trying to put himself in Sirius's position. If a girl liked you, you pretty much had to kiss them. Wasn't that the case? Was it awful if a girl didn't like you? If Sirius had liked Mary and James liked Lily, ought he to pick a girl too? Marlene was okay. A bit shy, like him. Maybe Marlene then. The thought kept him up at night, long after James and Sirius had both fallen asleep. They both slept in James's bed. Sirius had simply climbed in on the first night, and James hadn't said a word. Remus kept to himself on his designated camp bed. He tried to take his mind off it, think about Christmas and stockings and crackers, but it was all in vain. All he could think about was Sirius kissing Mary's cheek. And where had they done it? When had it happened? What did it feel like? Eventually, restless and overwrought, he got up to get some water. He padded out of the room and into the bathroom and across the hall and ran the tap. He sipped some of the tepid water and looked at himself in the mirror. In the dim light, he couldn't see his scars. Would a girl ever like him if he looked the way he looked? He would never be as good-looking as Sirius, or even James,
but perhaps he was slightly better than Peter. How on earth could you know? Suddenly, the lights flashed on, burning his retinas so that he almost dropped his glass. Oh, sorry. Phenomena stood up in the doorway in a long peach-coloured nightie. She looked shocked. What are you doing wandering around in the dark? Really good eyesight, he mumbled, stepping away from the sink. I couldn't sleep. Me neither, she sighed. Once the surprise had left her face, she looked sad again. Remus hoped she wouldn't cry. It was useless with crying. Oh God, if he got a girlfriend, would he have to deal with crying? He had no time to swallow back his panic before Phenomena began talking again. It's horrible to be away from family at Christmas, isn't it? I grew up in a children's home, actually. Oh, really? She looked interested for a moment. You're one of Peter's little friends, aren't you? I didn't know he knew any Muggleborns. Kept that quiet from Mummy. My dad was a wizard, Remus said with some confidence, but he died. Half-blood, she murmured. But even so. She trailed off despondently. Remus shifted uncomfortably. His bare feet were beginning to get cold on the bathroom tiles, and he was only wearing his underwear and a vest to sleep in, which was embarrassing enough. She didn't seem to mind. You're lucky, she said, not having to grow up with all this shit. You mean magic? Remus frowned. He'd never heard a witch or wizard, pure blood or Muggle, talk this way. Yeah, magic, she sniffed. What's so bloody good about magic, eh? What makes us so special? Do you want to know a secret? He didn't, but he thought it better not to say so. She carried on anyway, whispering now. I wish I was a Muggle sometimes, she said, a glimmer of madness in her eye. If I could do it, I'd run away forever and never be found. And I'd have a nice normal job and a nice normal life, and I'd fall in love with whoever I want. At this last affirmation, she burst into tears. You can do that anyway if you wanted, Remus said, quickly, not sure exactly why he was saying what he was saying. She looked at him suspiciously. What do you mean? Well, what's stopping you? He asked. You're of age. You can do whatever you feel like. Go be a waitress or run away to America and be a film star. Marry Prince Charles if you want to. I mean, you might need to use a bit of magic to get started, but you can give it up. No one says you have to do magic. She stared at him and looked up and down. No one's ever said that to me before, Remus shrugged. What's your name again? Remus Lupin. Oh, she burst out laughing. You poor thing. That's almost as bad as Phenomena. All the Young Dudes by Miss Kingbean 89, Chapter 51, 3rd Year, The Man Who Cried Wolf. Christmas Day 1973. Remus's odd late-night conversation with Phenomena had caused him to re-evaluate his anxieties about girlfriends. His ability to comfort her had stirred no particular feelings of chivalry or affection, only a mild sense of relief that he'd gotten her to stop crying. He definitely had no desire to get that close to any other girl. He thought about Narcissa for the first time in a while. Remus had secretly thought that Narcissa was the most beautiful girl he knew, before she dyed her hair anyway. She had a regal sharpness which appealed to him on some base level, but even she was made foolish by love, risking her own life in fact. The sight of Phenomena sobbing in her nightie only cemented in Remus's mind the revelation that love and relationships were not worth the misery. He had enough pain in his life. Let Sirius and James work it out for themselves, but for the time being, Remus felt very intelligent for having come to this realization so early in life. He'd probably saved himself a lot of needless stress. Christmas morning was as wonderful as it had been the year before. Even Phenomena perked up when she saw the gifts under the tree with her name on them. Remus was able to enjoy the immense satisfaction of handing out his own presents, and Sirius and the Potters were all suitably pleased and thanked him profusely. He himself had received a chess set from the Potters, which was perhaps the most expensive thing Remus had ever owned, and bought just for him, not second-hand. Along with the usual assortment of sweets and practical jokes from the Marauders, it was a very good haul. Sirius looked a bit nonplussed at breakfast, as everyone else wolfed down their smoked salmon and scrambled eggs. "What was you?" James asked, mouthful. Sirius shrugged. "Nothing from Andromeda," he said quietly. "I didn't think I'd get presents or anything, now she's got the baby, but I thought maybe a card. I sent her one." James swallowed and patted his friend's shoulder. Owl might just be flying late. You know how post is this time of year. James had received a brand new broom for Christmas, and as soon as breakfast was finished, with all three boys headed straight outside to test it. Sirius had his own broom with him, and Mr. Potter suggested with an arched eyebrow that Remus take James's old one. Yeah, have it if you want to, Mooney, James nodded enthusiastically. To keep. Thanks. Remus took it, unable to say no in front of James's parents. Goodness knew what he was supposed to do with it over the summer. Try explaining that one to Matron. James and Sirius spent the rest of the morning showing off, and Remus spent it hovering, just skimming the ground with his toes, trying to read his book and look like he was enjoying his room. He hoped Peter had received his gifts from them, and wasn't having too bad of a time with his own family. They were called in by the Potter's house elf, Gully, who was dressed in a festive tea towel and had a sprig of holly tucked behind one ear. It was almost lunchtime, and the house smelled deliciously of roast beef with all the trimmings. Upstairs, washing chains, a lot of you. Mrs. Potter shook a wooden spoon at them. I've had Gully set your things out. They washed and dressed quickly, stomachs growling as the wonderful smells from the kitchen wafted up the stairs. Just as they began to make their way down, there was a telltale crack of vibration outside the front door. Sirius tensed again, and Remus, one step behind him on the staircase, gripped his shoulder in a way that he hoped was comforting. Sirius turned around and looked Remus in the eye, giving him a gentle smile of appreciation. It was quite unserious-like, but it felt good. The bell rang and they both turned back to it, James running forward to open the door. A couple stood in the entranceway, a young man and a woman holding a bundle in her arms. He had a mop of fair curly hair, but was still rather stockily built. She was taller and more slender. As they stepped into the light of the hallway, Remus sucked in his breath. She was the spitting image of Sirius's cousin Bellatrix. No! Sirius gasped, starting forward, a smile bursting onto his face. Sirius! The young woman grinned back, and Remus relaxed, seeing that it was not Bellatrix at all. This woman had the same wildly curly hair as her sister, though it was much lighter a shade of brown. It had to be Andromeda. She passed the baby in her arms over to the man next to her, presumably her husband Ted, and stretched out her arms to pull Sirius into a huge hug. Remus watched with fierce jealousy, and not a little guilt. He had never seen Sirius so embraced by anyone, let alone a member of his own family. Remus made his way slowly down the stairs, as Mrs. Potter entered the hallway now, smiling widely, looking very pleased with herself. A good surprise, then? She asked, as Sirius shook Ted's hand and tentatively patted the baby's head. You did this? Sirius stared at James's mother in wonder. Effie was kind enough to invite us, Ted smiled, his eyes twinkling. Pleased to meet you, Sirius. Nice to meet someone in Andromeda's family. Come in, Mrs. Potter ushered the gathering into the hall. They all followed her towards the dining room, Remus last of all. Andromeda was the polar opposite to the rest of the Black family, or at least those Remus had met so far. Though she was as strikingly beautiful as the rest of them, with the same piercing eyes and biting wit, she was full of laughter and merriment. Ted clearly adored her too, and hardly seemed to mind that she left him with the baby most of the time. Dora was the strangest infant Remus had ever seen, though admittedly he had not met many. She was as cheerful as her mother, with a gummy grin. Her wisps of hair changed from purple to green to blue with each moment, which everyone else seemed to find cute rather than bizarre. Before sitting down to eat, they were joined by several other guests, old family friends of the Potters, including, much to Remus's excitement, old Darius Barebones. A toast, Mr. Potter raised his glass, rather tipsily at the end of the meal, to friends old and new. To the Potters, Andromeda raised her own glass, protectors of outcasts and defenders of black sheep everywhere. Everyone laughed and clinked glasses. I think I must be the most outcast, Sirius said happily. I'm a Gryffindor after all. To Gryffindor, Mr. Potter called out from the other end of the table. Only the Gryffindors toasted. Andromeda narrowed her eyes at Sirius. Think so, little cousin? Try marrying a non-relative. I'll have to, Sirius responded, as Gully cleared away the plate and Mrs. Potter fetched the Christmas pudding. After Sissy's wedding, there aren't any black women left. There's Dora. Excuse me, Ted said, protectively covering his daughter's ears.
Could we please get her through her first Christmas before arranging a betrothal? I'm teasing. Andromeda leaned over to kiss them both. Dora can marry anyone she likes when she's old enough, and I can say with absolute certainty that it won't be anyone at this table. Everyone laughed again. Remus eyed Darius furtively. He was looking just as merry as Mr. Potter, his face glowing red from the fire whiskey he'd been knocking back. Once the pudding was extinguished, served and eaten, crackers pulled and terrible jokes read out, the party adjourned to the living room. Mrs. Potter, Phenomena and Andromeda went upstairs to change into their party dresses. Mr. Potter smoked his pipe, and Ted settled Dora down for a nap. The boys settled into a game of Snap before Darius and Mr. Potter wrangled everyone into a round of charades. Remus had never played charades before, let alone magical charades, which involved a lot of red and gold sparks, though that might have just been the high spirits. In the evening, more guests began to arrive, and the house was soon full of music, laughter, and the pleasant chatter. Andromeda and Sirius appointed themselves DJs, rifling through their combined record collections and alternating blasting Slade's Merry Xmas Everybody and I Wish It Could Be Christmas Every Day by Wizard.
Are you ready, children? Yes! When the snowman brings the snow, well, I just might like to know, put a great big smile on somebody's face.
They're actually called Wizard, though, Sirius kept telling everyone earnestly. And just listen to it. Even Phenomena forgot her melancholy for a few hours, getting up and moving with the music along with James, who was just about the same height as her and had no clue how to dance, but was pretty chuffed when she took his hand and showed him how to twist. Quite sure he would not be missed, Remus slipped between the throngs of people and searched for Darius. There must have been 100 witches and wizards in attendance, some of them teachers at Hogwarts, who Remus did everything to avoid. He heard at least 3 people murmur that Dumbledore was there somewhere. "They're both blacks, you know," he heard one witch whisper into her friend as they watched Andromeda and Sirius giggling hysterically about the record player. "She's run off and had a baby with that Tonks chap, and the boy, well, he was the heir, but I've heard Orion is planning to contest it as soon as their younger boy is of age. Quite the little hellraiser from what I've heard. He can't be any worse than Orion was. I went to school with him. Nasty, vicious kid. Sirius is a ray of sunshine compared to Orion. And don't get me started on that bitch Walpurga." "Shh," the first witch said, nervously. "You never know who's listening these days, even at the Potters." "Well, what's he doing here at all? I'd like to know." "He's chums with the Potter boy. You know what Effie and Monty are like. They've taken in the Pettigrew's eldest too. She's over there." "Yes, I heard about that." "Well, it's no secret why she's here. The Pettigrews and the Potters are both pure blood, after all, despite the rumours. Mind you, Effie might want out quickly. If Philomena sees a chance to bag the black hair, Paul James isn't going to get a look in, is he? I mean, everybody knows what's going on. We all need to pick a side. The Potters have picked theirs a long time ago, I'm afraid."
Remus felt his blood boil. It was horrible hearing his friend spoken about like that. And the Potters, who Remus was absolutely certain had no ulterior motives when it came to their son, or the company he kept. They let James be friends with him, after all, knowing exactly what he was. He clenched his fist, wished he was allowed to do magic, do anything to shut those mean old bitches up. Sirius and Andromeda were now bawling at the top of their lungs, joined by James and Phenomena. Remus smiled and at the same moment finally caught sight of Darius. The old man was steaming drunk now, leaning heavily on the banister in the hallway, talking to an old woman who looked like she would very much like to get away from him. Remus straightened his back and consciously smoothed his features. He'd borrowed a set of James's smart dress robes for the occasion, and Phenomena had kindly performed a cosmetic spell on the scars. As such,
He hoped that he'd get away with at least appearing to be the son of a famous wizard, rather than a muggle brat from a children's home. "Good evening, Mr. Barebones," he said, affecting an accent learnt from 3 years of listening to James and Sirius's received pronunciation. He held out a hand to the old man, who shook it, looking at him puzzled. "Remus Lupin. You remember, we met last year." "Ah, yes, the Lupin boy."
"That's right," Remus nodded, smiling serenely, keeping his expression controlled. He handed Darius another whiskey, as the witch the old man had previously been talking to snuck away. "I believe you knew my father?"
"Lord Lupin, best jeweller I ever knew. Married a muggle somewhere in Wales, didn't he?"
"That's right," Remus said steadily. "My mother." He took a careful breath as Darius guzzled more whiskey, then cleared his throat.
"Did you know Lyle very well?" He found that Lyle was much easier to say than my father.
"Oh, quite well," Darius nodded enthusiastically, thrilled to have someone to talk to. "Worked under him in the ministry before the trouble started. Never knew anyone better with Boggarts. All Dementors come to that. The Azkaban liaison officers missed him, I could tell you."
"The trouble?"
Remus asked, swiping another glass of whiskey from Gully, who hurried past with a tray, handing it to the old man.
"Thank you, dear boy. Yes, the trouble. Nasty business, nasty." "You're talking about the events that led to Lyle's suicide?"
He couldn't say it.
Darius had to say it.
"I'm talking about the damn werewolves!" Darius slammed his whiskey glass down on a nearby sideboard.
"Forgive me," he muttered.
"Not at all," Remus replied, unblinking. "Do go on. I know the story, of course, but I'd like to hear about it from someone who knew him." Darius surveyed him carefully through his whiskey-added haze. He seemed to slump slightly before beginning the story. "We couldn't possibly know, understand, none of us. Well, Lyle was a great wizard, you hear me?" he slurred. Remus nodded. "But," the old man looked upwards, glassy-eyed, "well, he did have a tendency to obsess over things. That temper flew into rages at work, during committee hearings even."
"Committee hearings?"
Remus asked, almost breaking character.
"Hasn't your mother told you?"
Darius looked at him, surprised. "Bloody muggles, not fit to raise our children. I've said it for years," he sighed. "Your father was on several committees at the Ministry for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures." Remus was glad he had taken care of magical creatures. Otherwise, he might know nothing at all about this. As it was, he was able to nod knowingly. Darius continued. "Just as Arya, of course. He was giant in his field. But he liked his own way, and he was seen as a bit of an extremist in those days. Wanting an overhaul of the werewolf registry, better identification and tracking measures. We just didn't have the manpower for it, and resources were better spent elsewhere. And Lupin, he'd been working with dark creatures for so many years, and he thought he saw werewolves everywhere. Always saw danger where there clearly wasn't any. Honestly, we all thought he was an eccentric. We couldn't have known when they brought Greyback in. I was there. I saw him. Don't even mind telling you. None of us thought he was a threat. Clearly drunk, confused, a vagrant. That's what we thought. When Lupin went off on one of his rants about werewolves, well, we didn't think twice." "You let Greyback go," Remus said, stonily. Darius looked very sorry for himself now, almost weakly. He nodded. "We let him go. Of course now we know, if only we'd listened. Lyle killed himself just after that. Didn't even want to hear the committee's apology." He sighed and looked at Remus again. "I've always wondered what drove him to it, Some say it was the guilt, not being able to stop Greyback. I wouldn't have thought he was the type. And to abandon his family like that, I mean, you couldn't have been much more than a baby." "5, Remus said. "I was 5. "Yes, well," Darius shifted uncomfortably, looking morosely down at his empty glass. "I have my own little theory about what happened. What if Greyback came after him, eh? We know how dangerous he is now. We know he hates wizards more than anything else, and your father said some very unpleasant things. So I wonder, did Greyback go and get him? Did he bite him?
if that's what happened, then I must say, don't blame Lyle at all. Only good beast, a dead beast. Remus replied, feeling very hot and a bit dizzy. And Greyback? Last I heard, he's in a league with you-know-who. Darius shook his head. The damned irony of it all is that we need your father more than ever, still. He smiled at Remus kindly. Don't think he died in vain, dear boy. We did end up implementing a lot of his reforms, particularly where half-breeds are concerned. Can't escape the registry now. No, sir. He slammed his wizened old fist down. Excuse me. Remus turned quickly. He had heard enough. I hear Mrs. Potter calling. He slipped back into the crowd of merrymakers, the music still blaring as Sirius and Andromeda led everyone in the chorus.
So here it is, Merry Christmas, everybody's having fun. Look to the future now, it's only just begun.
All the Young Dudes by Miss Kingpin 89, Chapter 64, 4th Year, Christmas. Monday 23rd December 1974. Though Hogwarts had been as picturesque as a Christmas card under its blanket of island snow, the Marauders stepped off the train into London to grey southern drizzle. The weather continued in much the same way for most of Christmas break, meaning that sledging was off the cards this year, much to Remus's disappointment. It meant that the first few days before Christmas were pretty boring, and they made up for it by making regular trips into the village under Mr. Potter's huge black umbrella and spent long afternoons in the Muggle cinema there. Remus had convinced them to go. He hadn't been to see a film since he'd started at Hogwarts, and Steve's gang had been talking about Death Wish all summer, so he was dying to see it. It was just as exciting as he'd hoped, full of revenge and gore, and Charles Bronson reminded him a bit of Professor Ferox. James and Sirius were more interested in figuring out how the projector worked, which suited Remus just fine, because it meant that they agreed to go with him twice. However, boredom soon got the better of them, and on the third visit to the picture house, a distraction presented itself in the form of a group of girls queuing at the ticket booth. At once, James and Sirius stopped discussing the ins and outs of visual perception versus frame rate and started acting very oddly indeed. James made more of an effort to flatten his hair than ever, while Sirius began leaning casually against the wall as if he was James Dean. The girls obviously noticed and kept glancing back, then giggling amongst themselves. It must be freezing, wearing miniskirts in December, Remus thought to himself. Finally, the girls finished buying their tickets and went to the second screen. Mooney, Sirius said, not taking his eyes off the gaggle of long legs that had just passed. I bet we see something different today. Yeah, James nodded blankly. Remus looked up at the poster above the door. The Great Gatsby. He screwed up his face. Oh, it's a romance, though. What do you want to see that for? He protested. But it was too late. They were already halfway in. Remus settled down in the front row and resigned himself to his fate. It might not be that bad. He'd like Robert Redford and Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. He wasn't as cool as Charles Bronson, but he might shoot someone at the very least. Half an hour later, as much as he didn't want to admit it, Remus was thoroughly immersed in the film, for all its pastel shades and silly costumes. There had been no shooting so far, but he was hoping for the best, and in the meantime was rooting for Daisy to see sense and leave her awful husband. At some point, Remus glanced to his left to see if Sirius and James were enjoying the film too, and found that he had been abandoned. Twisting about in his seat, he stared into the darkness behind him, and could just about make out the dark shapes of his two friends sitting at the very back row, both engaged in some kind of horrendous teenage grappling match with the two girls from earlier. Mortified, Remus turned around at once, slouching down low in his red velvet seat. He couldn't concentrate on the film now, and he'd been right anyway. It was a stupid, boring, girly romance, and Robert Redford clearly wasn't going to shoot anyone anytime soon. In a split second, he made his decision and quickly left the theatre. It was too late now to get a ticket for Death Wish, and the usher behind the ticket stand was giving him a very pointed look, so he shoved his hands deep in his pockets and sloped out, feeling bitter and mean. The town James's parents lived in was a lot posher than the one Remus had grown up in. It was all pretty red brick cottages and oak trees. There was a big village green at the centre, and Remus could imagine cricket taking place there over the summer. It was raining now, though, and James had the umbrella, so Remus had no choice but to duck for cover under the nearest bush shelter. There was a little shop right opposite the bus stop, and he watched it for a while, checking out the simplest entry points. Not that he was going to break in. He definitely could. It looked really easy. But what if Mr. and Mrs. Potter found out? They'd never have him for Christmas again. He thought about going back to the house, but he didn't want to explain why he'd left James and Sirius at the picture house like that. Pricks. He kicked the side of the shelter with his heavy boots. An old woman, walking past with a little Scotty dog, tutted at him loudly, and he swore in return, throwing up his middle finger. Even James had let him down. James, whose pure and honest adoration for Lily Evans had been the one thing which convinced Remus that snogging might not be that disgusting after all. He'd expected something like this from Sirius, who never had any kind of impulse control anyway. But James! Oi, Mooney! As if by magic, James and Sirius appeared on the other side of the road, underneath the big black umbrella. He tried to ignore them, but it was a bit stupid, seeing as they were the only three on the street. Where are you off to? Sirius grinned, as they crossed to join him under the bush shelter. Just sitting here, Remus shrugged. Why'd you leave? Could ask you the same. We only popped off for a minute. Ugh, I don't want to hear about it. Remus covered his ears. Glad at James. What about Lily? What about, it's not time yet, but I don't mind. Remus parroted back the words James had spoken in November. James looked stricken for a moment, but Sirius laughed hardly and slapped Remus on the shoulder. Oh, come off it. Evans isn't going to care if Potter snugged some muggle girl when he was 14. Calm down, Mooney. That's it. If there was anything more likely to send Remus into rage, it was being told to calm down. No, he growled. You made me watch a stupid girls' film just so you could grope a couple of muggle birds in the back row. Sirius tossed his head and rolled his eyes. Merlin, Lupin, we can go and see your beloved Charles Bronson tomorrow if you really want. I mean, excuse us if we want to act like normal teenagers for 5 minutes. Something about this insult struck Remus so sharply that if he had had his wand in his hand, he would have cursed Sirius right then and there. As it was, he only had his fists. Fortunately, he was pretty good with those, and punching was often a lot more satisfying than cursing. By the time James had wrenched them apart and stood between them, Sirius's nose was extremely bloody, and Remus could feel the beginnings of a black eye forming. What's wrong with you two? James huffed, dragging them both back through the rain to his parents' house. He's a tosser, Remus spat, trying to keep the drizzle out of his sore eye. He's a wanker, Sirius returned, stuffily, holding his wet jumper up against his nose. You're both dickheads, James said, firmly, as they reached the front gate. Mrs. Potter fixed them both up very quickly. She was just as quick at healing spells as Madame Pumphrey, then gave them a good telling off, with Mr. Potter standing beside her, trying not to smile and saying, Boys will be boys, Effie dear. Afterwards, Remus went straight up to the spare room and sat on his bed for the rest of the day doing his holiday homework. He knew it was silly and childish to sulk, but if he had to see Sirius again, he couldn't be sure he wouldn't swing at him. He thought about Ferrex telling him it's good to be angry, but somehow didn't think that's what the teacher meant. Was he jealous? Jealous that all of his friends had copped up with the girl now, and he hadn't? Maybe that was it. Remus couldn't really ignore the fact that he was the only one of his friends who wasn't completely driven by his hormones, like a normal teenager, as Sirius had so kindly put it. Ouch, there was that pain again. Remus drew his knees up under his chin, making himself as small as possible. He had to get him for every way in which he was not normal. He went down for dinner, but didn't talk to James or Sirius, limiting himself only to polite interchanges with Mr. and Mrs. Potter. After they were excused from the table, he went straight back upstairs and curled up under his duvet for a book until he fell asleep. He dreamed that he was back in the cinema, trying to watch a strange combination of The Great Gatsby and Death Wish, in which Professor Ferrex really was Charles Bronson, black moustache and all, aiming his pistol at the gleaming socialites of West Egg.
Something kept nudging Remus's elbow, distracting him from the film. He turned and saw that it was Peter and Desdemona, writhing about in the seat beside him, lips locked. Annoyed, Remus got up and sat in the row behind, returning to the film. Soon, something else bothered him. It was Mary and Darren. Remus, of course, had never met Darren, and the boy in the dream looked just like Mortimer for some reason. They were snogging too. Disgusted, Remus tried to get up once more, but tripped over Lily and James, who were rolling in the aisle. "For God's sake!" he shouted. Lily looked up at him and laughed. So did Mary, and now Peter and James too. Sirius appeared at the very back of the theatre, his body silhouetted by the whirring projector. "Never mind him," he laughed along with the others. "He's not like us." Remus spun around in time to see Ferric shoot Robert Redford, then woke up with a start. He was hot and sweating under the heavy duvet, and had to fight to free himself. Feeling very silly for having a nightmare at his age, he clambered out of the large four-poster bed and headed for the nearest bathroom. The clock on the landing read midnight, so he didn't turn any lights on, though he could see a faint yellowish glow seeping out from under James's bedroom door. Remus used the loo, then washed his hands and face, taking a few sips from the cool tap before wiping himself dry on his pyjama sleeves. Feeling much better, he returned to his bedroom, just as James's door swung open. "Bloody hell! It's you, Mooney," James whispered, sounding relieved. "What are you doing creeping around in the dark?" Remus shrugged and whispered back. "I can see in the dark. Didn't want to wake anyone up." James nodded and opened his door a bit wider. "Thought you might be Gully, spying on us for Mum or something. Come in, eh? Let's all be mates again." Didn't take much convincing for Remus to agree. Fighting took up too much energy, especially when you all lived together. He still didn't really want to talk to Sirius, but he went in for James's sake. Sirius was sitting cross-legged on James's bed and frowned when he saw Remus. James sighed. "Come on, we're all friends, right? It's Christmas." Sirius nodded solemnly. Remus nodded back. He joined them on the bed, where he was surprised to see they were poring over spellbooks. "Homework?" he asked. "Prank," James replied. "Haven't worked out the kinks yet, though." "Oh, okay," Remus nodded. And then, because he didn't want to be awkward anymore, he asked, "How's your nose, Black?" "Fine," Sirius grinned at him, relaxing to humour at once. "You're losing your touch." Remus smirked. "Oh yeah? I'll Snape. Ed butted him on the train in September." "You never did." "Yup." "Bloody hell," James laughed. "And he hasn't tried it on since?" "Not yet," Remus said, trying not to sound too nervous about it. "Probably planning something, though. What's the prank?" "We'll, tell you when we know how to do it. Might not come off right," James said, quickly, closing the book nearest to him. Remus raised an eyebrow and said nothing. This only confirmed the suspicion he'd had for quite some time. He didn't want to get into any of that now, though. He'd wait and see if anything came of it. "Sorry I brought up Lily," he told James. "I didn't mean it. Sirius is right. She won't care. If she's ever stupid enough to go out with you, that is." James shoved him playfully. "Piss off." "At least that stupid competition is over now, yeah?" Remus asked, hopefully, looking at Sirius. "Yeah, I suppose," Sirius shrugged. "We paid Pete his dues anyway." "What a letdown, though. Snogging. I mean, dunno what all the fuss is about." Remus didn't say anything, though he was secretly pleased. So he wasn't missing out on anything after all. "It was all right," James said, diplomatically. "Probably takes practice. Must get better." "It'd better," Sirius said, very seriously. James and Remus burst out laughing. Christmas Day 1974. Christmas morning was as dark and gloomy as the previous week had been, and Remus was woken by the noise of rain pelting against his bedroom window. Still, the Potter's house was as festive as ever, and the five of them settled down to a hearty breakfast with smiles on their faces. Breakfast was quickly followed by presents, the usual fare of sweets, chocolate, new quilts from the Potters, books and socks. Remus was very surprised to receive a hand-knitted scarf from Lily, in Gryffindor red with gold tassels. He felt a bit bad. He hadn't bought anything for any of the Marauders this year, let alone any of the girls. She'd never given him a gift before, except for the reading aid, which, I had to admit, had been a pretty good present. He resolved to get something for her next time they went to Hogsmeade. They were just finishing up with the presents. Mrs. Potter vanished in the scrunched up wrapping paper with a sweep of her wand, when a loud, mournful song sounded in the hallway. It was a high-pitched, haunting melody, completely unnatural and completely beautiful. They all turned at once. Mr. and Mrs. Potter withdrew their wands in a dueling stance, and a strange, ethereal silver bird flew into the room, circling their heads. Remus recognised it at once as a phoenix, or something like the ghost of one. Dumbledore, Mr. Potter said quietly, as the silver phoenix settled majestically on the mantelpiece. Much to Remus's surprise, the bird opened his beak and spoke in the headmaster's voice. There has been an attack. I will be with you shortly. Do not allow anyone else entry. And with that, the phoenix vanished into thin air. They were all quiet for a while before Mrs. Potter spoke, placing her hand on James's shoulder as if she just needed to touch her son. Oh, Monty, an attack! No need to panic, Mr. Potter said calmly. Albus will be here soon. Boys, finish cleaning up here. I'll be in my study. They tidied up in silence, all waiting to see what would happen next. An attack? What could that mean? Remus's mind went straight to Greyback, but it wasn't a full moon, so unlikely to have been werewolves. Could it have been Voldemort? Or were there other dark wizards out there? Guiltily, he looked over at Sirius, who was staring out the window at his reign, looking pale and shocked. His family were dark wizards. Did he know anything about it? Surely not. Remus quickly dismissed the idea, feeling even worse. Sirius hadn't been home since the summer, and it was common knowledge that his family hated him. Finally, after what felt like a decade, but could have only been 20 minutes, there was a crack of apparition outside, and Mr. Potter was at the front door. Mrs. Potter joined him, and James, Sirius and Remus hung back in the hallway, watching. The door opened, and Dumbledore stood looking there, very grave, completely dry, despite the rain beating down his sheets. Clement, Euphemia? He nodded politely. Mr. Potter held up his wand. What was the last thing we spoke about? Your son having broken his record for number of detentions this term. Dumbledore smiled, glancing at James, who turned red. This apparently satisfied Mr. Potter, who stepped back to allow Dumbledore entry. Come in, Dumbledore. Would you like some tea? Mrs. Potter asked, taking his travelling cloak and ushering him to the living room. Upstairs, boys, Mr. Potter said sternly. James looked about to argue, but Dumbledore stepped in for him. If you wouldn't mind, Clement, I think it best the boys hear this. It will be all over the papers tomorrow anyway. Mr. Potter looked at his wife, then nodded. The small party sat down in the large living room, waiting for Goody to come in with the tea. It was a very odd scene. Christmas cards still glittering on the walls, tinsel sparkling along the picture rails, open presents piled up under the tree, and Dumbledore, still looking uncharacteristically serious in the midnight blue velvet robes. Sirius, James and Remus sat squashed up on one sofa, while Mr. Potter remained standing, pacing the room. An attack, then, he finally said, impatient. I'm afraid so. The Fraser family in Newcastle. Fraser? Never heard of them. No, Mr. and Mrs. Fraser were both Muggle-born. They had 2 children, not old enough for Hogwarts, but as far as we know, showing signs of magical ability. Remus winced at the past tense. Mr. Potter had clearly noticed this too, for he looked up, very pale and tired all of a sudden. All 4 of them? Yes. Mrs. Potter looked like she was about to cry. Children! She gasped. Children! And do we know for sure? Mr. Potter continued, anxiously. We know it was him. Voldemort, yes. He left a mark. A mark? It will be in the papers tomorrow, I imagine. The Daily Prophet was there before I was alerted. But what does it mean? Who were the Frasers? Mr. Fraser worked for St. Mungo's, Dumbledore explained. It recently raised a petition with the ministry suggesting that Ediths receive training in Muggle-learning techniques. First aid, I believe he called it. This didn't go down very well with certain factions, I'm sure you can imagine. I think I remember Darius saying something. Mr. Potter nodded, leaning a hand on the mantelpiece, thoughtfully. But to kill? It hasn't been the first time, Dumbledore said, darkly. But it is the first time they've made themselves known. This mark that was left behind, it has been seen elsewhere. Some of the old families have adopted it, a kind of secret sign of their allegiance to Voldemort, only not so secret anymore. Which families? Sirius said, suddenly, looking at Dumbledore. He was tense all over. Remus could feel it. Dumbledore looked at him kindly. There is so far nothing linking the Blacks to the attack. So far, Sirius repeated. But you know, they're... It doesn't help anybody to jump to conclusions, Dumbledore held up a hand. The situation is grave, yes, but we must not lose our heads or allow emotion to cloud our judgment. There are difficult times ahead, and we will all need each other to be vigilant. He said this directly to Sirius, and seemed to be speaking to James and Remus too. Remus felt an uncomfortable twist in his abdomen. He didn't understand everything, and he knew that some great responsibility had been settled on their shoulders, one he wasn't sure he could live up to. I'm not trying to frighten anyone, Dumbledore continued, as if he had read Remus's mind, but nor do I wish to devalue the seriousness of today's events. I am working quickly to gather support, a line of defence against Voldemort. I have already spoken to a number of trustworthy associates within the ministry. Fleamont, can I count on you? Of course, Mr. Potter said at once. Have you spoken to the Weasleys, the Prewetts, the Boneses? Dumbledore nodded, smiling. All on my list, of course. We can help, James spoke up. Mrs. Potter sucked in a breath, her eyes still very pink. Yeah, Sirius said, eager to show himself equal to James. You can depend on us, sir. Remus didn't say anything, but he nodded along, hoping that Dumbledore knew that each year had chosen his side. I hope it won't come to that. Dumbledore was smiling, his forget-me-not blue eyes twinkling with emotion for his pupils. But thank you, boys. No, Mrs. Potter said. They're children, Dumbledore. I'm of age in 2 years, Sirius said, straightening up, asserting his position as the eldest Marauder. And we're the best in the year at defence spells. And axes, James put in, then quickly shut up, seeing the look his mother shot at him. Dumbledore chuckled softly. Indeed, he said. Your mother is quite right, however. All I ask is that you are on your guard, and that you look after each other. Now, I must be going. I have other calls to make. Fleamont, Dumbledore stood up and shook Mr. Potter's hand. I'll be in touch. Euphemia, he turned to Mrs. Potter apologetically. Merry Christmas. I'm afraid I won't be attending your party tonight. We might as well cancel it, Mrs. Potter rubbed her arms, as if the room had turned cold. It seems disrespectful. Enjoy your holidays, boys. Remus, Min and Pomfrey will meet you at the Three Broomsticks flue stop on Sunday morning. Remus nodded obediently, and with that, Dumbledore vanished with a loud crack.